Hi, I'm James, and in today's video I'm taking a look at this, which is the Acer Swift SF114-34 laptop. And this is a laptop which I wouldn't normally feature, being based around a Pentium Silver based chip. However, I've picked it up for a few reasons, partly because at the moment it is very good value in the Black Friday sales. I bought this one for £279. Also because it features the Intel Pentium Silver N6000 processor, so is based on the newer 10nm Jasper Lake chips. And I haven't had a chance to try these before, and they look like they offer a reasonable uplift in performance and make them more interesting than their 40nm predecessors. I also picked it up because at this price point it has quite a nice feature set. We have a backlit keyboard, IPS display, Wi-Fi 6, a silent design because this is fanless, and a fingerprint sensor. So without further ado, let's take a look at the laptop and see how it stacks up. Acer's Swift range is what they term as their thin and light range of systems. So these sit as a smaller, lighter option versus their Aspire machines. This machine certainly fits that bill, coming in at under 15mm thick. It is also just under 323mm wide and under 213mm deep. So a nice compact system. It is 1.3 kilograms according to Acer's official specification for the machine, and one thing I did notice is on the Amazon listing it was listed as being aluminium. That seems to just be referring to the colour. The body of the machine is almost certainly plastic. It would have been a real surprise at this point to see a metal chassis. Just to compare, putting the machine alongside a MacBook Air 2017, and we can see that the laptop is narrower, shallower, and overall is a similar thickness to Apple's older generation MacBook Air, although it is worth noting that that is the maximum thickness and that the Apple laptop does taper down towards the edges and particularly at the front. Looking at the port selection, obviously we have our regular power connector here. This is quite a small plug on this, which can be a bit of a pain it won't likely be similar to any other laptop you have. The HDMI port here, which they don't specify if this is 1.4 or 2.0, so I will be testing this later. A USB 3.2 Gen 1, so 5 gigabit per second USB-A port, and that indicates that it can also be used for charging devices. Then again, USB 3.2 Gen 1 USB-C port. This USB-C port does not support USB power delivery or DisplayPort, so when I tested I was unable to charge the laptop with it. It failed to recognise any charger, and it also failed to recognise any monitor being connected when I connected it through my USB-C dock. So really you might use this for if you have any USB-C memory sticks or for connecting your phone, but not useful for a sort of all-in-one docking station. On the other side we have a Kensington lock for if you want to secure your laptop to a hard surface. Interestingly, battery charging and power indicator LEDs. You can see the laptop is currently asleep. A lot of laptops seem to omit that now, and it is actually quite nice to have them just so you can check the status sometimes without switching things on. Another USB 3.2 Gen 1 port, so again 5 gigabits per second, and a headphone jack. When you open the laptop, you can see there are some little rubberized feet on the bottom of the little hinge bits, and it does lift the laptop slightly to raise it, which can be quite nice for typing on the keyboard. Because this is a fanless system, there are no vents on the bottom, so quite good if you're using it on your lap or on a fabric surface, because you're not going to be covering those vents, but it does mean this air gap isn't really going to benefit you in terms of air intake. Looking at the base, and we can see there are no air intakes. It is purely cooled by convection with the heat spreader inside and warming the base of the laptop. It is only a 6-watt TDP chip though, so that shouldn't be an issue. Acer have used quite a few screws in the base here and haven't made any effort to hide these. And the rubber feet here are black rather than being coloured with the chassis. Having them in a sort of silver grey may have looked a bit neater, but black is going to look less grubby over time. The two speakers have openings here in the bottom of the machine firing downwards. Unfortunately, Acer do not specify the power of these, but I would probably guess at 2 watts or lower they should be fairly basic but standard fare. Looking at input devices, and the keyboard has a fairly standard chiclet layout. We do have a backlight. This doesn't have multiple brightnesses, there is simply F8 serves as the on-off button. On the keyboard layout itself, I have no real issue with any of the choices that Acer have made with this. It's nice to have the function and the ability to home and end on the page up and page down. Sometimes see these combined into the arrow keys, which I quite like, but not in this case. One thing that does bug me slightly on the keyboard is if you're doing something like Alt F4, you actually have to do Alt Function F4, otherwise you're just changing the brightness. Some laptops are smart enough where if you combine Alt and F4 they switch away from that function to the F4 itself, but in this case Acer haven't implemented that. Looking at the touchpad itself, and it is 105mm wide and 65mm tall. I perhaps would have liked to seen a bit more height given to it just by raising the keyboard a little higher in the chassis and extending the touchpad up, but otherwise I have no real issue with its use. It feels nice to touch and responsive enough, and it supports the usual sort of two-finger scrolling and other gestures that you expect to find on Windows 10 using the standard touchpad options in settings. To the side of the palm rest underneath the keyboard we also have the fingerprint sensor, and having just quickly trained this I found it quite quick and responsive. Having it here outside the keyboard isn't perhaps the most pretty aesthetic choice versus taking up a position up here, as you see sort of on the Dells where they dual function it with the power button, but it works well, and that's a minor aesthetic choice. It might have looked nicer if it was silver rather than black, but not too concerned about that. One thing that really does impress with this machine, particularly given its price point, is that we have this IPS 1080p display. I found in use that actually colours and viewing angles are pretty good. As we move the screen around we don't see too much shift in colours, same as we go side to side. I don't always know how well the camera is picking this up, but in actual use it's pretty good. I don't think the brightness is the highest that you'll find. It's probably around 220 nits. Unfortunately Acer don't give a value for this in their specifications, but for a sub £300 laptop I would say this is one of the better screens that I have seen. So looking at the Windows install out of the box, and we can see, as was specified with this machine, it comes with Windows 10 Home in S mode. I'll be switching this out into full Windows 10 Home through my Microsoft account shortly, but we are looking at it as standard to begin with. We can also see, so in terms of pre-installed apps, there are a few to note. So we have Acer product registration, which can be safely removed, Apps Explorer from Sweet Labs, Acer's Care Center, Dropbox in S mode. We also have down here a booking.com link, which I would be removing. We have that I can see Norton or McAfee or third-party antivirus, but we do have a few sort of card games pre-installed, which can be easily enough removed. So not too much in the way of additional software, as you would expect for a machine shipping in S mode. One thing that is also interesting, having said that Acer don't specify on that HDMI output, and we're actually connected currently to an Elgato 4K card, and we can see not only did it connect 4K without issue, but if we look at the advanced display settings, we can see this is 60 Hz, so this is actually an HDMI 2.0 port or better. Looking at the hardware of the system, and we can see that CPU-Z confirms that this is a Jasper Lake-based chip with a 10nm process. Watching the clock speeds, we can see that it does indeed go up to 3.3 GHz. Unfortunately, CPU-Z cannot identify the memory configuration. I believe this is LPDDR4 2933, and it appears to be from bandwidth numbers in a single channel configuration. Crystal Disk Info shows us that this is a Western Digital SN520 PCI 3 2x device. It is a 128GB SSD, so not a large drive, but adequate for basic use. And if we look in Crystal Disk Mark, we can see that this has a peak read for sequentials of around 1.5 to 1.6 gigabytes per second, and write is only 500 megabytes per second. Now this is probably going to be down to the fact that simply 128 gigabyte SSDs rarely have many channels, so they really struggle to deliver the peak performance, but it is still better than you would find on a cheap SATA SSD, and certainly on the read speed does better than you would expect from those. Looking at Cinebench, and we get a score of 603 on the multi-threaded test. I was going to run the single-threaded test, but the amount of time that it was going to take was just simply too long. This puts it sort of a little better, maybe on a par to something like the old dual-core i3 7100U, which would score similar performance, but bearing in mind that that is a 2-core 4-thread processor, where this is 4-core 4 threads. So the older i3s, based on the Skylake architecture, probably have better single-threaded performance, but the extra cores on this come out to give it similar multi-threaded performance. But for a Pentium Silver, it is pleasingly acceptable in terms of performance here. We can also see, using HW Monitor, that the battery is 48 watt hours, and the processor, even though it goes up to a maximum of 11 watts here, so it can turbo above that 6 watt TDP, but in general, particularly if you use the sort of lower power profile, sits around 6 watts, but for short loads can go above that. But even without the fan, temperatures have been pretty good as I've been using it, at around 74 degrees at maximum, currently idling around 48 for the whole package. Battery life, and I don't really have a representative number for this because I've been running Cinebench on the battery, which obviously draws down what it thinks it's going to take, but with 82% remaining, it's saying that you should have over 7 hours of battery life. If you're not doing something silly like loading up all 4 cores for 10 minutes, I would expect this to be better, so you may find that you get around 10 hours from this machine on battery life. So one question I was very interested to answer for myself was actually, is performance of the Intel Pentium N6000 good enough? And to be honest, for basic usage, yeah, it's absolutely fine. We foresee, having just restarted the machine and signed into Edge and opening Word, instantly you do get a year's free Office Personal or Microsoft 365 Personal with the laptop. I am not activating that as I will probably resell this laptop at some point. But loading these applications, it is absolutely fine. It is certainly not going to be a multitasking powerhouse because you only have that 4 gigabytes of memory, and that is probably my biggest bugbearer with the system. But in terms of general responsiveness, the combination of the N6000 and that NVMe SSD, even though it isn't a fast drive, is totally acceptable. Of course, it's never going to be a gaming powerhouse, particularly with just the 4 gigabytes of RAM, but loading up Minecraft, the Windows 10 version, which we have downloaded from the Windows 10 store, since this is running S mode out of the box normally. And going into the game, we can see actually performance is all right. This is obviously not the Java version. I have to admit I'm not au fait with the latest versions of Minecraft now. But for basic gaming, you will get by with a system like this. Again, the 4 GB of RAM may well prove to be a bigger limitation than the processor in this. Particularly, I believe this uses the 11th gen 32EU graphics that you also find in the entry-level Core i3 11th gen. That may have slightly more execution units, but the lack of memory and the possibly single-channel memory configuration is going to be a bigger limitation than the actual IGP, I would suspect. So overall, what do we make of the Acer Swift 1 SF114-34 laptop? Well, for starters, it's really hard to argue that this laptop represents anything other than excellent value at the £279 price point. The combination of an IPS display, fingerprint reader, backlit keyboard and NVMe SSD as opposed to eMMC are something that you don't see typically all combined at this price point. You also get a year's Microsoft 365 personal subscription included, which does have around a £50 value, which is great if you don't already have one of those. This also helps with the limited storage with only 128GB to play with. If you have a lot of photos and documents, you can use the 1TB OneDrive to put files into that and then have them sync to the machine as required. One of the compromises here, of course, is that you are getting a Pentium Silver based chip. This definitely improves over the previous 5000 series, but it is going to be weaker than even a 10th generation Ice Lake Core i3 and certainly the Tiger Lake i3s as well. Likewise, while it is great to see that we have an NVMe SSD in here, it could be a faster drive. Write speeds of 500 megabytes a second are similar to what you can get from a SATA drive, and while read speeds are higher and will lead to better loading times particularly, it's not up there with the better NVMe SSDs you get, but really to improve on this you'd probably find you need a higher capacity drive. Additionally, while it is nice to see USB-C implemented, it's done in the most bare bones way possible. The lack of USB power delivery or DisplayPort to me makes it not all that worthwhile because you can't use it as a docking station when you've got the machine on the desk. You're going to have to plug in multiple cables for display and power rather than a single cable for everything. Probably the biggest downside of the whole system is that 4GB DDR4 being limiting for any multitasking scenario and non-upgradable as it is soldered to the main board. And finally, well, the value proposition of this is really going to depend when you're watching this video. A lot of this is based on the fact that I've bought it at £279 on Black Friday pricing. And if these have risen, then it obviously affects how good value this is and how it stacks up against the competition. I feel at the moment that it is a very good buy if you're looking for a laptop which is thin, portable, and can compromise on the performance, particularly the lack of memory. It is worth considering because you do have some other really strong points. But for those who expect more power from their laptop, it perhaps won't be for them. And so finally, I'd just like to thank you for watching, and please comment if you have any questions you'd like answered on the machine, hit like if you found this helpful, and subscribe if you'd like to see more videos in the future as we post them. Thanks for watching.